Last time we examined the instruction God gave us through the Apostle Paul on what it takes for each individual called by God to run the Christian race and make it to the finish line. We also reviewed the glorious prize awaiting all who run and finish this race. Let's briefly review those instructions that we covered last time by looking at this one verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Please turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 24. Paul writes, "Do you not know that those running in a race all run, but one receives the prize?" So, Paul continues. This is addressed to us now. So run. He's telling us. So run that you may obtain. Verse 25 continues. This is from the New American Standard. It says, "Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things." Note this, brethren. Exercises self-control in all things. No exceptions. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath or crown, but we an imperishable. So we find here then that running the Christian race is an imperative. It is not optional. But let's never forget, brethren, the magnificent future God has in store for us. God is looking forward with pleasure, as Jesus Christ told his disciples to give us the kingdom. We find that back in Luke chapter 12. We cannot even imagine, we cannot even begin to imagine what that will be like. Nevertheless, that is what we are running towards. Now, the first vital piece of instruction we examined was the need for all runners to exercise self-control, as we just read in verse 25. Now, unlike the runners in Paul's day, who by human effort and willpower exercise self-control, the self-control God requires must originate from the power that he has given us, the power of his Holy Spirit. We're not talking about mere willpower, mere self-discipline, something that we do on our own. Self-control, as we saw the last time in Galatians 5, is a fruit of the Spirit. So let's continue then with the instructions God has recorded for us to keep running, because we have to keep running. So the next vital piece of information we're going to look at is that we must run with our eyes clearly on the goal. We must run with our eyes clearly on the goal. Let's notice again, we're still in 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 26. Paul continues. This is from the New International Version rendering. Paul writes, therefore, 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 26. Therefore, he writes, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. Couple other translations put the first part of this verse such. From the Goodspeed rendering. So that is the way I run, unswervingly. Phillips rendered that verse, I run the race with determination. So here we find then another vivid example of Paul's approach to the Christian race. He's not like a runner who does not know where the finish line is. He does not run as one who has no specific objective. He puts his whole being, as Paul says, I do not run like a man running aimlessly, stumbling all over the place, don't know where he's going. He puts his whole being into the race that he's running. Paul here is running with determination, unswervingly. Now, back in Paul's day, the runners in the games ran towards a fixed mark. Perhaps it was a stone, but something that we all can relate to. It was a finish line. They had a goal that they run towards. They did not run carelessly, but for one purpose. For one purpose, to finish the race. Now, the word that's translated in this verse, uncertainty, and you read that in the New King James, uncertainty, or as far as in the NIV, aimlessly, the word means without a definite goal or purpose. Without a definite goal or purpose. So what Paul in essence is saying here, that he runs with a purpose. Again, he does not run aimlessly, he runs with a purpose. And of all the people, brethren, on the face of this earth, God has given his people a very special goal to focus our minds on. God has opened our eyes to the awesome reality of not only why we are here and where we are going, but also the road that we need to take to get there. What an incredible blessing. You cannot run the Christian race without your eyes clearly on the goal, or else you are running aimlessly. That is what Paul is bringing out here. Now, the question that we need to consider, something we need to ask ourselves from time to time, does it seem like you're running in circles sometimes, getting nowhere fast? That's the question. That's the reality we face from time to time. But as we see here, Paul was not like the runner running in circles, who did not know where the finish line was. Paul had a goal, and his goal was to make it to that finish line. His objective was clear. He had it in his mind's eye what he was focused on. So have all the runners who have crossed the finish line. There are those who have already crossed the finish line. Let's examine the example of one who have crossed the finish line. And notice his determination. Notice his resolve. We're all familiar with this account. Let's go back in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. And notice what it says here. But Daniel purposed in his heart. Another translation simply said, he made up his mind. He simply made up his mind. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he asked permission of the chief of the officers that he might not defile himself. Brethren, we see here right at the outset, we see where Daniel's heart and mind was. Completely set on pleasing God, no matter what it took. No matter what. Here was an individual who was called to run the race of life. And even though he was an exile in a foreign land, he was resolved to be true to his God in everything. He was unswerving in his determination. The fact that his physical life was under the control of the most powerful ruler at the time was incidental. It didn't matter. we read here, he purposed in his heart. He made up his mind. And for that, God showed mercy on him. Now let's step back and consider Daniel's situation. It's easy to see how Daniel could have used human reason and ate whatever was put before him without concern as to whether or not it met God's standards. After all, the reasoning might go, well, I'm in prison, virtual prison. I have no control over my life. Other people give me things to do, so if I want to stay alive, I just eat what is put before me. But again, Daniel purposed in his heart. And because he did that, God gave him favor before those who were in control of his life. He had a definite goal or purpose in mind. No running aimlessly for him. Let's notice another example briefly. Daniel chapter 6. Daniel 6 and verse 10. Daniel 6 and verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, what writing is referred to? You read the previous verses, we talk about they made a law that says you could only pray to make petition to a certain deity or else you're in trouble. They passed these laws, and it says here, Daniel knew. It wasn't a rumor. He wasn't unsure of it. He said Daniel knew that the writing was signed. He went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem. Notice, brethren, how bold Daniel was in his service towards God. He wasn't going to hide. He wasn't going to crawl under a rock. What did he do? He did what was his normal practice, as it says here. And in his upper room, with his window open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as his custom was since his early days. Daniel knew that he had to stay close to God, no matter what laws man might come up with, or no matter what he himself stood to lose personally. It didn't matter. This is another example, brethren, of Satan the devil's continued attempt to put roadblocks in front of us, to get us disoriented, to get us to run aimlessly instead of focusing our mind on the goal. As we see here, Daniel was not unaware of what was going on. Daniel was fully aware of the tactics of Satan the devil, as Paul writes. We are not unaware of Satan's devices. Daniel was not unaware of Satan's devices. And he was not about to allow Satan to get advantage of him. He knew there is only one road that leads to life. And that road, brethren, is the straight and the narrow one. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how determined are we not to let anything compromise your relationship with God? How determined are you not to let anything compromise your relationship with God? Daniel made absolutely no attempt to hide his determination to stay the course. He was going to forge right ahead no matter what. We can come up with a host of excuses as to why we shouldn't do what we do. Let's just notice a couple of excuses. We're quite familiar with these, and sometimes we say them in jest sometimes, but these excuses can lead to deadly consequences. Proverbs 22. Proverbs 22 and verse 13. This is a very famous one. Proverbs 22 and verse 13. The lazy man says, there's a lion outside. I shall be slain in the streets. Very similar, almost the same is in Proverbs 26 and verse 13. You can read that for yourselves. There's a lion in the streets. I shall be slain. There's a lion outside. I shall be slain. For Daniel, brethren, this was no imaginary lion that was in the streets, but a real lion right in his bedroom. He saw it with his own eyes. It was no imaginary lion. So again, how many times do we come up with excuses or justifications as to why we can't do the things that we should do? It's too this, it's too that, it's whatever. We know what our excuses are. Daniel had a perfect excuse as to why he should maybe ease up on a little bit with his devotion. Because if we go back and read Daniel, it was only for 30 days that this law was for. 30 days. But 30 days was 30 days too much that Daniel decided he was not going to allow 30 days to get in between him and God. He was going to be continually beseeching his God 3 times a day, day after day after day. In Proverbs 4 and verse 26, let's take a look at that. Proverbs 4 and verse 26. Here's some caution to us, brethren. This is a caution. Proverbs 4 and 26 says, ponder. That Hebrew word means consider. It means to weigh mentally. It means to think about. So it says here, ponder the path of your feet and let all your ways be established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Remove your foot from evil. This is an admonition to all those running the Christian race, not to run aimlessly, but to think about what you are doing and run decisively. We must take care, brethren, that our every step conforms to what has been laid out for us by Jesus Christ. He is the way. He is the truth. He's the one who has laid that path out for us. Now, the word that's translated established, it means to be steadfast. So, let all your ways be established. It means let all your ways be steadfast. It means to be sure. Unswerving adherence to the Word of God is essential. As this last sentence in verse 27 says, remove your foot from evil. We're going to come back to that thought a little later. Remove your foot from evil. We must take care then to place each step in the straight path. We must also be careful to keep each foot away from evil. Next proverb we're going to turn to, and we're quite familiar. This is one of those memory ones that we all know. Proverbs 28 and Proverbs 29 and verse 18. Proverbs 29 and verse 18. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Now, that word perish can also mean run wild. Where there is no vision, the people run wild. Running aimlessly or running wild is the result of having no vision. To be among those who win the race, as well as those who run, because remember, it's not just running, as Paul admonished us earlier. It's about winning. But we have to run and we have to win the race, which means We have to come to that finish line. Coming to the finish line is what we mean by winning. So to be among those who run and also those who win, we must know where we are going and be quite sure we intend to get there. Paul made up his mind not to seek the approval of men. How about us, brethren? Whose approval are we seeking? Whose approval are we seeking that's getting in the way of our relationship with God? Paul decided that he would give up everything. On his road to Damascus, he said, "What would you have me to do, Lord?" That was it. He made a 180-degree turn and went in the other direction. He made up his mind that he wasn't going to no longer seek the approval of men, but to seek first the kingdom of God and the righteousness that comes from being united with Jesus Christ. He judged that he would live to do what Christ wanted him to do. Let's note the driving force that propelled the Apostle Paul towards the goal, day in and day out. In Philippians, please turn to Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 10. Philippians 3 and verse 10. Paul writes, "That I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share his suffering." Notice, share his suffering. Too many times he don't like to think about suffering. Again, we're going to come to that in a little bit. But here is what Paul said. "That I might know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share his suffering, becoming like him in his death, that by any means I may attain the resurrection from the dead." Without the resurrection, there is absolutely no hope of an incorruptible crown. No hope without the resurrection. Continuing in verse 12, "Not as though I have already received or have already been perfected." Paul never stopped learning. He didn't think he knew it all, even after having direct revelation from Jesus Christ. He never stopped learning, as he brings out here. Continuing, "But I am striving," or "I am pursuing." That's a literal rendering of that phrase. "I am striving," or "I am pursuing, so that I may also lay hold on that which I also was laid hold of by Christ Jesus." Verse 13, he continues, "Brethren, I do not count myself to have attained, but this one thing I do." Note what Paul's focus is. This one thing I do. We ask ourselves a question. Is this our mindset? This one thing I do, forgetting the things that are behind and reaching forth to the things that are ahead. I press towards the goal for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Brethren, forgetting those things that are behind, I want us the hardest thing that we have to do. And as we see, it's not getting any easier. Because as we know, Christ warned his disciples in the Olivet prophecies, there will be offenses, there will be betrayals, there will be hatreds. This is the reality we are living in now. Paul suffered tremendously, even from some of the ones he personally pastored, not just preached the gospel to them. But he said, those things are behind. His eyes was forward. He continued to run. He had that goal ahead of him. Now, So again, keep in mind the image of the runner. So as a runner, Paul vividly brings out here, forgets the things that are behind, and stretching out towards the things that are before him. Just as a man runs with his body inclines forward. We've seen runners, we see how the body inclines forward as you're going forward. You're going forward, your whole body is, you're reaching forward. So that we can have this image in our minds as we see Paul's focus and moving forward. He's grasping, he's going to the finish line, and his eyesight and his heart is way ahead of his mind, of his body, that is, in wanting to get to that place where he wants to go. That is the finish line. As far as Paul was concerned, the afflictions, the hardships, the beatings, the imprisonments, the sleepless nights, the hunger, and so on and so forth. And you can read all these things where he gives a catalog, a list of the sufferings he went through in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. You can refer that. All of what he had to go through, it was nothing. They were nothing compared to the goal that was ahead of him. He was going to keep on running, forgetting what was behind, and pressing forward towards that goal. How about us, brethren? Are we so determined? Are we so determined to forget about those things that are behind? I mean, there's nothing that we can do about it anyway. We cannot change the past. We cannot change what happened in the past. Paul knew that. He understood that. We can learn from the past. Problem is, we don't learn from the past. That's part of the problem. But Paul says we must learn. We must forget those things and we must push ahead, go forward, because there's more that has to be done. Let's notice in 2 Corinthians 5, this gives us an example of the focus of Paul and how he resisted all the distractions. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 14. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 14 says, "For the love of Christ constrains," oh, that word can also be compels. The love of Christ compels us or constrains us, because we judge thus, that if one died for all, then all died. And he died for all. And those who live should live no longer for themselves. Brethren, do we understand what the Apostle Paul just said right here? Christ died for those whom God has called to him and applied the blood of the Lamb. So we have a responsibility, as Paul brings out here. We have an obligation. We have a duty as slaves to Jesus Christ, not to live for ourselves, continuing, but for him who died for them and rose again. So here we find then the motivation that kept Paul focused. What was that? It was the love of Christ. It is God's love that caused him to give his Son for us. Likewise, it is that same love that caused Jesus Christ to willingly lay down himself. He willingly lay down his life as a ransom. It is only fitting then that we should be motivated by the same love for Christ. So we see here then that running aimlessly, that is without a definite goal or purpose, as Paul reminded us, has no place in the life of a Christian. Absolutely no place in the life of a Christian. Paul is like a runner Paul is not like a runner who doesn't know where the finishing line is, or a boxer who hits nothing but air. Let's go back again to 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 26, where he states this. 1 Corinthians 9, notice the last part of verse 26. So fight I as one, not as one that beats the air. Paul doesn't pull any punches here. He don't waste his effort. Paul's Christianity is focused. He puts everything towards the goal for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. His mind was focused on that goal. Now, the second instruction, the second piece of instruction we want to focus in on is that we must run the race in earnest. We must run the race in earnest. That is, we must be zealous about the opportunity that we have been given. We must be zealous about the opportunity that we have been given. Let's notice it. Let's read again verse 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 26. See what Paul writes here. Again, therefore I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. But notice he goes on to say, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection. That phrase literally means I beat my body and make it my slave. That is the literal rendering of that phrase. Paul says, I beat my body and make it my slave, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Paul is pretty graphic here in describing the zeal to which he applied himself in running the race. Instead of running aimlessly, as if he doesn't know where the finish line is, Paul says, I beat my body and make it my slave. Well, what does he mean by that? Paul fought against his sinful desires with the merciless intensity of competitors in a boxing match. Paul refused to be bound by the desires of the flesh. In the figurative language as we are reading here, he describes the way he disciplines himself. Now, if you look back at what we just read, I beat my body, the word translated beat is from the Greek verb for boxing. It's a boxing terminology from back in those days. It's from the Greek verb that means to give a black eye to. This is pretty graphic. To give a black eye. Paul wasn't pulling punches here, no pun intended. To give a black eye to. So this, coupled with the fact that he make his body his slave, it leaves no doubt as to the zeal to which Paul strove to subdue his own body. The reality is, brethren, every person's body is his own, is his enemy. Instead of being his servant, it becomes his master. How many times do we give in to the dictates of our own bodies? We all know what they are: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and so on and so forth. Our bodies become our master. But Paul says here he was relentless. He gave his body the black eye, so to speak. He beat his body. So Paul shows then that when his body presumed to dictate to his spirit and demanded comfort and indulgences that were not right, he beat it down. this unmerciful, overpowering blow Paul dealt to his body, resisting its assaults and making it helpless to tempt him. He was unmerciful with his own body. He thus then brought it into subjection and made it its slave. And the last part of this verse is verse 27. We find what the purpose of all this relentless discipline is. Paul was concerned that, as we read here, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. The fact that God chose Paul for a tremendous mission did not mean that he himself did not have to rigorously apply the teaching to himself. The fact is, he was even more accountable for what God gave him. And he knew it. He absolutely knew it. Now, in this section, brethren, I'm sure we understand that Paul was not advocating any form of physical masochism. You know, there are those in the world who would like to look at this and take it literally. Paul was not doing that any more than what Jesus taught his disciples. Let's note what Jesus taught his disciples back in Matthew 5 and verse 29. Jesus Christ was pretty plain here in what he told his disciples. But we have to understand that he was speaking figuratively. In Matthew 5 and verse 29, he said, if your right eye causes you to sin. Now, here is the cause of sin. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. That's pretty drastic. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into Gehenna. This is serious business here, Christ says. You have a choice. If something is causing you to sin, you either get rid of it or you're going to go into Gehenna fire. This is the reality everyone has to face at one time or another. Verse 30, and if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into Gehenna fire, into Gehenna. That's the Greek word that they translate as hell, but it is Gehenna. We find here Jesus Christ is teaching his disciples principles. In this instance, we see the question that we must consider, brethren, how far are we willing to go to give up that which will keep us out of the kingdom of God? That is the reality Christ is bringing out to his disciples. How far are you willing to go to give up that which will keep you out of the kingdom of God? The command to get rid of these offensive eyes or hands is an example of Christ's, again, dramatic use of figure of speech. What he was advocating was not a literal self-maiming, of course we know that, but a ruthless moral self-denial. A ruthless moral self-denial. We must deny ourselves, as Christ brings out in another place. We must absolutely reject sinful practices so resolutely that we must either die to them or put them to death. That is the choice we face. Paul, in the spirit of what Jesus Christ instructed his disciples, focuses our attention on the zeal we must exhibit as we run this race. Remember, brethren, as we covered earlier, we are not competing against any other person. This is not a competition against any other human being. We are in competition only against ourselves, against our flesh. And zeal is only profitable if it's a zeal according to God's mind. We live in a world today where you can look on the news. There's a lot of zealous, people are doing a lot of zealous things. But the question we have asked, is it a zeal according to the mind of God? We all know what the answer is if we are striving to have the mind of God. So let's take a look at the third piece of vital instruction then, after Paul admonishes us to run in earnest, to be zealous. Let's notice in Hebrews chapter 12. And the first piece of instruction that we're going to look at is that we must run the race with endurance. We must run the race with endurance. Let's notice Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. Paul again writes, Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Pretty clear language Paul is instructed us. Here, we must run with endurance. And brethren, when all is said and done, when all the blood, all the sweat, all the tears that we have shed, all of that will be of naught. It will be nothing if we do not run with endurance, if we do not make it to the finish line. To make it to the finish line, we must run with endurance. We must endure to the end. Now, Paul begins this section by referring back to what he had just covered in Hebrews 11. He referred to the cloud of witnesses. Now, the cloud of witnesses that Paul is referring to here are all those runners who have completed the race. We don't have to go back and rehearse that. We don't have the time right now. So the first encouragement then to run the race with endurance Paul gives us, Paul encourages us, is to yield ourselves to the influence of the cloud of witnesses that surround us. Let them influence us and follow their example of faith and endurance. We have Abel, we have Enoch and Noah, we have Abraham and Sarah, Moses and the prophets, and so on. As with one heart and one mouth witness to us. Here is what they're saying to us. Be of good courage. Fear not. Be strong in faith. And persevere or endure. The victory and the reward is sure and glorious. For them, brethren, the victory and the reward is sure. We still have to run. So they are encouraging us to keep running. Now, Paul in this verse here next encourages Christians of the absolute need to take certain actions if they are to run the race with endurance. Paul says, okay, I'm telling you how to run the race. Now here is how you run the race with endurance. First thing is there are two things. There are two distinct things mentioned here that we must do. The first thing Paul mentioned is that we must throw off every weight. We must throw off every weight. Now, what does that mean? The allusion Paul makes here, casting aside every weight, or throwing off every weight, it gives us a picture of an runner. A runner who is stripped down to the barest essentials. We see this all the time. They're stripped down to the barest essential, unburdened of every weight, thus allowing them complete freedom of movement. I don't think we have seen any runners running with boots and an overcoat. You're not going to find that, because they will get tired real quick. So Paul's saying, figuratively, we must cast off every weight. Now, what does weight mean? The Greek word that translated weight, it means that which serves to hinder or prevent someone from doing something. Weight means it's a hindrance, it's an impediment. There are many things that can hold us back which may not be sin of and by themselves. These things can be ambitions, anxieties, habits, pleasures, self-indulgences, even associations, brethren, the company that we keep. These things can be internal, external, physical, emotional, or spiritual. There are a whole host of things. But it's up to each and every one of us to look deeply and ask God to help us to identify those things that are impeding our spiritual progress. Each runner must honestly judge what is hindering him or her and resolutely lay it aside. Take it off, cast it aside. So it's up to each person to do that. And what is interesting about this is that what's a weight to one person may not be a weight to someone else. This is individual. So you may be laboring onto a weight, and then you have seen somebody that doesn't bother them. So this is very individual. A weight is very individual. Unlike what sin is, which allows no individual choice, each individual must determine what these weights or hindrances are, and that they must be cast aside. This calls to mind, brethren, what Christ told his disciples in Matthew 10. Let's look at some verses. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. Matthew 10, verse 37. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross or stake and follow after me is not worthy of me. It's pretty plain here. Christ is showing here that loving, as we know, brethren, loving our families and those close to us goes without saying. We shouldn't have to be told that. We know that. But we see here that our love, so-called, so to speak, our love can become a weight. Even our love for our own families can become a weight if it becomes before our love for Christ. Jesus Christ is saying, whatever it is, Whatever it is that prevents us from taking up our stake and following Him is a weight. It must be gotten rid of. In Luke chapter 9, let's notice something very similar. Luke chapter 9 and verse 59. Luke 9 and verse 59. And then he said to another, "Follow me." But he said, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and preach the kingdom of God." What an opportunity this individual was given. But he refused. He turned it down. And another said, "Lord, I will follow you, but let me go and bid them farewell who are at my house." Verse 62, Jesus said to him, No one having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. Brethren, if we know these scriptures, and the fact of the matter is, if we only apply these scriptures to when we face the choice as to whether we would come out of the world or not, or whether we will respond to God's invitation or not, if we only apply these scriptures to that point in our lives, we are making a serious mistake. These and similar choices we have to continue to make all during our lifetime. Which is more important? What is more important? Who is more important? Christ shows us that perfectly legitimate things. There's nothing wrong with go to be with your parents or to go say goodbye. But Christ is showing here perfectly legitimate things can become weights that prevents us from running the race we are required to run. In Luke chapter 21 and verse 34. Luke 21 and verse 34. Jesus, again speaking to his disciples, says, "Take heed to yourself." New Living Translation states, "Watch out. Watch out, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly." It's easy to look at carousing and drunkenness and say, that's pretty obvious. But then let's focus on the cares of this life. Cares of this life. We have to live in this world. Christ said when he was praying to the Father on that night, that he did not pray that they would bring them out of the world, but that they would keep them from the evil one. So we have to live in this world. But Jesus Christ said, the cares of this life, we can be weighed down. Weighed down. Remember, Christ was the one who instructed Paul to write the fact that these weights must be cast off. And keep in mind who Christ is speaking to here. Christ is speaking to, he's addressing these men who had given up everything for this sake and have proved the reality of their faith by loving obedience and complete devotion to him. He was their master. But he cautioned them, watch out. There's a trap there that you do not become weighed down by the cares of this life. The cares of this life, brethren, are very insidious and may seem to legitimately demand our attention at that time. We got to do it now. But Christ cautions his disciples, you must be careful. And let's note again that the cares of this life is placed next to carousing and drunkenness. These are obvious sins, showing that we can't afford to minimize the impact these things have in our lives. Brethren, we should never never forget that we may make spiritual shipwreck on things that are lawful, things that are okay, so to speak. We can make spiritual shipwreck of our lives. So we must throw off these weights, these hindrances. Back in Hebrews 12, verse 1, let's notice the next thing that we must get rid of. We must get rid of every sin. Every sin. Sin, as we mentioned before, sin is sin. Whoever does it. But weights, again, as we said, may be weight to one person and not a weight to another. But notice how Paul describes this sin. Paul describes sin as that which so easily ensnares us. So notice he doesn't say lay aside the sin. He says that which so easily ensnares us. He puts a qualification there. So what are we then to learn by that? What can we learn by the qualification Paul puts on sin? The word translated ensnares, and that is in the New King James. In the King James it said beset. It pertains to the exertion of tight control. Being in control of, controlling tightly. So we understand, brethren, why Paul adds this qualification to sin. Because we must get rid of the sin which controls us so tightly. Sin would like to enslave us. After having been set free by the blood of the Passover lamb, sin wraps the sinner with strong cords and easily entangles its victim. All sin, as Paul brings out here, all sin is an ensnaring sin. It traps, it encircles, it exercises tight control. All sin. It is characteristic of every kind of transgression, in that it circles us around, that is always lying in wait, waiting for the opportunity to take control. If we remember Cain, what God said to Cain back in Genesis, you don't have to turn there, I'll just read it. Cain was warned, he was given a warning by God not to let sin have mastery over him. But notice what God says in Genesis 4 and verse 6. Genesis 4 and verse 6, reading this from the New Living Translation. God asked Cain, "Why are you so angry?" The Lord asked Cain. "Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you do what is right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out." This is God's instructions to Cain. Watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control. Notice again the use of the term control. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control. Eager to control you, but you must subdue it and be its master. Cain had a choice, but he didn't listen to God, and sin took tight control of him, took tight control of his life. Let's notice what Jesus stated back in John. Let's notice in John chapter 8 what Jesus said about sin. John chapter 8 and verse 34. John 8 and verse 34. Jesus replied to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, that everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin." Everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin. So, what Christ is saying here then, not only does the practice of sin, and the Greek word that's, the Greek here is literally the one who does sin, but not only does the practice of sin then proves that one is a slave to sin, but the practice of sin actively enslaves. The more you do it, the more you are enslaved. It actively enslaves. Even Paul himself could vouch for the bondage of sin from his own experience. Let's notice back in Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7 and verse 14. This is from the New American Standard. Romans 7 and verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am flesh. And note what he says here, sold into bondage to sin. Dropping down into verse 23. But I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin. Notice what Paul said. He was a prisoner. The law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Then he goes on to say, who will? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, as on the one hand, I myself, with the mind, I'm serving the law of God, but on the other, with the flesh, the law of sin. Paul recognized the controlling nature of sin. He fought back with the power God provided. He understood, brethren, that sin forms a crippling hindrance to running the race. You simply cannot run the race unless it is cast off, removed. The problem we face living in this world is that we want to find out how to have the best of both worlds. You know, the old story, you want to have our cake and eat it too. But as far as God is concerned, there's no such thing. Let's notice what it says in 1 John 2. We're quite familiar with this verse. There's no such thing as the best in both worlds. Because it says here in 1 John 2 and verse 17, 1 John 2 verse 17, and the world is passing away and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever. The word translated passing away means to go out of existence, to disappear, to perish. Do we understand, brethren, the reality of these words? The Apostle John was inspired to write, this world is perishing. It's about to disappear. So let's be absolutely clear about this, brethren. This world is not going to last much longer. The Apostle John is not using a figure of speech here. This is a literal statement. There is no best of this world that Jesus Christ will retain. You know, Christ, when he comes back and says, you know, the things that they did back then, that was a good idea. I think I'll use that. No, he's not going to, it's going to be destroyed. This world is passing away. In Luke 14 and verse 33, Luke 14 and verse 33, Jesus Christ states, so likewise, whoever of you who does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. So, brother, we are called to forsake every weight and the sin which clings so easily to us. Jesus says, unless we do this, we simply cannot be his disciple. Sin, again, must be laid aside if we are to run this race. It is a race for righteousness. And as we read the last time, we talk about the crown of righteousness that Paul talks about. So it is a race for righteousness. It is a race for life. It is a race for glory. It is a race for holiness and perfection, for the will of God and His favor. How then, brethren, how can we even dream of running the race without getting rid, without laying aside sin which so easily ensnares us? Without laying aside these weights and sin, there is no way, absolutely no way, that we can run the race with endurance. The question is then, what does it take for us? How can we run this race with endurance? How could we run this race with endurance? We must be keenly aware of the fact that there are those who are not running the race who's out to trip us up. We must understand that. There are those who are not running the race who are out to trip us up. Let's notice in Galatians 5 and verse 7. Galatians 5 and verse 7, where Paul writes, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" You were running well. So we find here Paul compliments the Galatian Christians that they were running well. They were running a good race. And something happened. The gospel message Paul brought to them set the course for their lives. They were running well in that course. But then they were distracted, tripped up, and so hindered from running the race. So we have to understand, brethren, not only do we face internal challenges while running this race, but we also face external challenges, external distractions, such as obstacles or hindrances. We must run then with steadfast endurance. But this steadfast endurance doesn't mean the patience that we just sit down and accept things, but the patience which masters them. We go forward. It is a determination which goes steadfastly on and refuses to be deflected. Obstacles do not daunt it, nor discouragements, nor does it take our hope away. That is the steadfast endurance. It is the steadfast endurance that enables a runner to carry on until the end of the race. Let's notice what James says in James chapter 1. James chapter 1 and verse 2. James writes, consider it, James 1 and verse 2, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Again, brethren, we don't like to think about this. We don't like to hear this, but this is the reality. Jesus says here, God inspired James to write, God's way of producing spiritual endurance is through various trials. Trials. It says the testing of your faith produces endurance. James says that this testing, faith has been tested, but it produces this quality of endurance. Paul states the same thing virtually in Romans 5 and verse 3. You don't have to turn there. It says, Romans 5 and verse 3 says, not only that, but we boast. Now, this may sound like an oxymoron, boast. We boast in our suffering. How can you boast in your suffering? Same as James was talking about, consider it all joy. Two of them doesn't seem to go together. But with the mind of God, we can understand. Paul writes, we boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Here it is again, brethren. Suffering produces endurance. Now, there's only one factor then that can make this consistent endurance possible. Let's go back to Hebrews 12 and verse 2, and let's see what that is. Hebrews 12 and verse 2. It says, the last part of verse 2, Paul writes, "Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." He continues, "Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, and has sat down on the right hand of the throne of God." So Paul began this section by urging us, yes, we must listen to the testimony of those who have gone before us. But, he says, above everything, above all things, Paul says, fix your eyes on Jesus Christ. Now, what does that mean? Let's look at an example of one who fixed his eyes on Christ. Turn to the book of Job. Now, we may not consider Job as a runner in the context, but we see how this applies. Job 1 and verse 1. Now, when Paul says to fix our eyes on Christ, to see an object, to be looking at an object, we must be able to see that object. If someone tells you to look at that object over there and you don't see it, you don't know what he's talking about. So then, Paul says, fix your eyes on Christ. What does he mean? Job chapter 1 and verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. Dropping down to verse 8. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and an upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil." Now, this was the assessment God gave Job. He was a world-class runner, heading straight for the line, heading straight for the kingdom of God. Now, let's consider, brethren, everything that we've said so far about what it takes to be a runner applied to Job to a T. It fits him perfectly. The first thing that we covered, Job was self-controlled. Job was so self-controlled. Notice what it says here. You don't have to turn there. Job 31 and verse 1. "I made a covenant with my eyes. How then should I look with intensity on a virgin?" Job was so self-controlled, he was able to bring every thought into the captivity of Christ. That was the measure of his control, brethren. He was that running on that road with self-control Paul was talking about. The next thing we talked about is having your eyes clearly on the goal. Job had his eyes fixed on the goal. Notice what it says here in Job 19 and verse 25. Job 19 and verse 25. Job said, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand in the latter days upon the earth." That was Job's. He knew what his goal was. He knew that his Redeemer lives. He knew what that meant to him. Next thing we covered was that Job ran in earnest. He was so zealous that he even entreated God on behalf of his children. Let's note this in Job 1 and verse 5. Job chapter 1 and verse 5. "And it was so when the day of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sacrificed and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offering according to the number of them all. For Job said, It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Job, brethren, ran the race with endurance. Job ran the race with endurance. We find this in James 5 and verse 11. James 5 and verse 11. We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job. This is, again, James 5 and verse 11 from the New American Standard. You have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealing, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. Brethren, the outcome of God's dealing with Job reveals the tremendous mercy and compassion of God. But there was one critical lesson that Job had to learn. He not only had to run with endurance, but he had to learn to look to Jesus. Of course, the Word of the Old Testament was the one. He had to learn to look to Jesus, to fix his eyes on Jesus. Job was running this race well, as we covered back in Galatians. Paul compliments the Galatians. Here we find it was God who complimented Job. What better, what higher compliment, brethren, can there be? God himself said, Job, you're running this race great. You're running well. But there was a lesson he had to learn. And as the race progressed, we see what that lesson was. We see how God allowed the devil to get Job to focus on his righteousness. Even Job's 3 friends could find nothing in the way he was running. Nothing. They could find no fault. Neither could they find any weights or sins that were weighing him down. Consider, brethren, Paul says, get rid of those weights. Job was running. He was stripped down. He was down to his bare essentials. But Job's 3 friends couldn't find any weights or sins. They instead became tools of the devil. But notice, brethren, the vital lesson that Job learned, because he did learn the lesson. Remember that we said he needed to fix his eyes on Jesus. Job 42 and verse 1, New Revised Standard. Job 42 and verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this? Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, that which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and declare you, and declare to me, and you declare to me, And notice what Job said in verse 5. I heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but that wasn't enough. But now my eyes sees you. Now my eyes sees you. Job, brethren, learned the lesson. He learned that he had to fix his eyes on Jesus. He learned that he could not trust in his own self-discipline, the amount of discipline that he could exert in himself. He learned his righteousness was like filthy rags. He says, now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Brethren, Job could not make it to the finish line without fixing his eyes on Jesus. As he ran the race, even though he was running with endurance, he had to focus his mind on and follow the example of the one who was the author and finisher of his faith, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is running ahead of us as our guide to the finishing line. We must get rid of every hindrance and focus our minds on him. If we do these things, notice the tremendous promises God makes to the church. These are God's promises to him. These are God's promises to those who cast off those sins, cast off those weights, those who look to his Son. These are the promises of God. Revelation 3 and verse 10. Revelation 3 and verse 10. Because you, these are the words of Christ. Because you have kept my word, note here, of patient endurance. You have kept my word of patient endurance. I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. In Isaiah 48, in Isaiah 40, Isaiah, this is again another promise. Isaiah 40, verse 28. The question is asked, have you not known? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, neither faints, nor is weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the weak. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might he increases strength. Even the youths shall fail and be faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fail. But notice the promise in verse 31. But those who wait on the Lord, what is going to happen to those who wait on the Lord? Those who continue to patiently endure shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Brethren, these are God's promises. They are sure. So let's make sure we do our part and claim these promises.